Okay, this is a video to show you a tile layout for a mosaic tile. I'm doing this for my bathroom, and I have right now what I call a dry fit. I have the tile down dry, no quick set, and I want to show you a little bit about how I went about this, what my technique is. Now, where I started was at the shower here. I wanted, my first attempt was to align these to be parallel with the tub, this shower stall. And I laid out some reference lines, and I actually laid all the squares out. Not all of them, just the ones in the center, not the ones that I would have to cut on the edges. And I found a slight problem. What I found was that as I got down into this corner, what I found was these tiles were clipping the wall. In other words, I was ending up with very short pieces against the wall because it wasn't parallel to the wall. It was just slightly off, teeny bit. And I thought about that for a while, and then I realized what I had read in some of the articles on how to do this. I hadn't done this before. And then it dawned on me because I ran into the same problem when I was doing hardwood floor. And this is the problem. The problem is that when this shower stall was put in, it's not actually parallel. I get a lot of sun coming in here. It's not parallel to the walls. It's just off a very slight amount. So what happens is, if you lay this parallel to this shower, and the shower is only about 2 feet wide, the line that produces by the time you get 10 feet down is not running parallel to that wall. So here's the idea. It only takes a very small adjustment in the tiles that are running along here. You don't make them parallel to this, but only by a teeny bit, because whatever error you have to add, it gets magnified by about 5 at the end of the room. So if it's missing by a ½ an inch down there, well, this would be only less than 1/8 of an inch, for example. So, and what you notice in this case, for example, I have a 1/8 inch spacer here, and it's a little bit more than that. But on this side, it's a little bit more, probably like an extra 16th. That extra 16th turns out to be about a 1/4 of an inch off, and that's kind of what I was running into there. I only have a 1/2 inch baseboard, and the error was exceeding what I could do with the baseboard in terms of covering it. Okay, so then I realized, okay, I have to lay it out parallel to the wall, basically, and then here it won't be so bad. Now, another thing I noticed, I hadn't known this before, but now I realize it. It turns out the edge of this shower stall is not actually a straight line. It's actually bowed in the middle. At first I thought this was some sort of a defect. But when I checked the tub, which is the same manufacturer, it's got the exact same characteristic. When I caulk this caulk line is going to be thicker in the middle than on the two ends. But I don't think that's a problem. First I thought I might somehow should straighten this out, but no, that's not the way it is. It's just not exactly that way. I mean, I'm going to have an 1/8 of an inch on the two ends, and in the middle it's going to be about a 1/4 of an inch. So as far as the caulk line goes, it's no big deal. It's going to be fine. In this particular case, I've been using this almond caulk because it's an almond tub, and I think that'll work okay here. I did read that you're supposed to use caulk between the tile and the acrylic, or in this case fiberglass shower stall. The caulk goes between the tiles, but you're not supposed to put caulk here, it will crack. Okay? Anyway, so much for that. Now, the other major thing in doing the layout here is determining the spacer that you're going to use between the mats. Okay? You'd like to use a space between the mats which is equal to the grout spacing within the mat. Okay, but the question is, what is the grout spacing in the mat? And the funny thing is, when I look at the website for this manufacturer, for this tile, the recommended grout joint is actually a 1/16 of an inch. Now that doesn't seem like a good choice because the actual spacing of the grout lines inside of a mat is about 1/8 of an inch. And the other thing about this is, the specification of this mosaic sheet is listed as 11 3/4 by 11 3/4, but when you actually measure it, it's actually 11 13/16. Anyway, I originally had this spaced out on 1 foot, a 1 foot pitch. Okay, it was convenient, and at the time I thought it was actually correct. Mistakenly, I thought somehow that since it was so close to a foot, that the manufacturer must have intended it to be laid out at a 1 foot pitch. Originally, when I did the grid, I did it simply for convenience. It was convenient to lay it out at 1 foot, and then when I started putting the tiles down, I noticed they look pretty good. The reason I did it at a foot is because I took I wanted to draw a line that was parallel to the tub. So I measured out a foot off the 2 corners of the tub, and I snapped a chalk line down the room. Then I noticed that when I put a tile down between that 1 foot line, it fit perfectly in there. But it turns out it wasn't perfect. Turns out the dimension of this tile is 11 3/4 plus a 1/16. Then if you added a 1/8 inch space, you get 11 15/16. It's 1/16 shy of a foot. So if you lay it out at one pitch, it turns out the grout lines are about 1/16 wider than they should be. So the correct answer is 1/8 of an inch. And I have 1/8 inch spacers in here now after I figured that out. I have a call into the manufacturer here. I think they just simply have an error on the website. The recommended space, I believe the correct answer is 1/8 of an inch, not a 1/16 of an inch. Now it turns out the actual grout lines inside the mosaic, it's not exactly 1/8 of an inch, okay? For example, you really can't get one of these spacers in here. It turns out it's about 90% of that. It's shy by about 1/10 of 1/8 of an inch, which is a very small number. And you'll notice on this mosaic, each of these tiles is slightly different in their unit dimension. So the grout lines within it are not all exactly the same. But I made very careful measurements and averaged it out. The average, it turns out, is 0.9 times that. And that 0.9 times 1/8 of an inch, which is why the 1/8 of an inch spacer does not fit in there. But I believe the 1/8 of an inch spacer is the best size, I should say. The available sizes that I found at the hardware store went from 1/16 to 1/8. I don't think a 1/16 is going to be the right one. I think you'll end up with lines that are just narrower than what you want. These ones will end up as just a teeny bit larger than what you want. Now remember, the spacer only dictates that the space will not be less than 1/8 of an inch. It doesn't say that it will be equal to 1/8 of an inch because it'll be a little bit larger. And you can't really pack all of these in perfectly because each mosaic is not perfect. The mat is not perfectly square and what have you. So this ends up with something that is on the average going to be a little bit more. Now what happened is when I laid this out at a 1 foot pitch, for example, I ended up, this mat here, that line, that reference line there, actually came to this edge. This edge would have been up on that line. When I laid it out with the 1/8 inch spacers, it came out there. So what happens is the actual spacing was slightly less, only by a very small amount. This is over a 10-foot space. But the thing is, though, with the 1/8 inch spacers, it self-spaces itself. And when I had it out at a 1 foot, I was trying to put it within the squares and they were moving all over the place. It was very frustrating. When I got the spacers and then I laid it out, then I realized, okay, that's the way it must have been intended because, of course, I do reference lines down at 1 foot, but once you put the thin set down, you don't see those reference lines anymore. And you're going to have a very, very difficult time. Now, what I did here was I did a complete dry fit. I cut all of the pieces, including all the corners and everything. Now, I cut, in fact, the spacers on the walls. And what I did, here's what I did. After I did a complete dry fit, I marked the center of the grout lines for each of where between the mats go. So when I put down the thin set and I start setting these in, I'm going to be able to set it in the thin set, put in a spacer, and I'm going to be able to align it on the start, on the edges, and then the spacers themselves are going to more or less regulate this. So by that time I get down to this far end, you see, when I do the actual job, I have to start at the far side and work my way back to the door. When I work my way back to the door, I want to know that everything that I've done here is going to end up in this position. I can't be off even by a small amount. And that's why having these, if there was a very small error as I'm working my way down, I'm just going to correct for that on each row by aligning the spacer on the marks. Okay, even if that means the spacer is slightly loose, I'm not going to snug them up into the spacer. I'm looking to hit my alignment marks that I've already laid down. Here's my 1/2-inch baseboard, okay? And that shows you that it's okay, okay? Here's a case where I did a cut. I didn't have to cut the unit tile in that case. Here's a case where, okay, in order to get a gap, I had to cut the unit. That's actually slightly less than a tile. It's about 3/4 of a tile. I had to cut off about 1/4 of the tile in order to actually get a little bit of clearance. I didn't want that to be so tight that it was wedged. I don't want it to be wedged in against the wall. 2 reasons. One is you're supposed to have some space between the tile and the wall because you don't want expansion of the wall to try to buckle your tile. And the other thing is, any sort of, as you're putting it in, if there was any sort of error in the mat, that'll get absorbed. In other words, it can tolerate a teeny amount of shift. And when the thing is, if you have a layout that is wedged against a wall, it can't tolerate any sort of movement or error. Now, because I have the spacers marked, honestly, I shouldn't get any additional error. So even if it was flush up against the wall, I should still be able to recreate it when I'm actually gluing it down with the thin set. But it's against the rule simply because there needs to be a space for expansion. I'm not sure what the actual number is. I'm just targeting 1/8 of an inch here. That 1/8 of an inch is the same number that I used for the concrete board. Okay, the cement board. So I think it's going to be okay. Now I know there was a lot going on here. It's completely laid out, and I have a complete set of spacers, and I'm going to plan on boxing it all up row by row, putting the thin set down, and then I think it's ready to go. I do have the toilet, the cutout here, but I don't think there's nothing special here about this in terms of the layout, from the layout point of view. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's basically, that's been going on long enough. There were some issues here. It turns out on this very last edge, that's like that's a single row of a mat, okay? But that's fine. It would have been nicer. The tiles, as I lay them in, I just have to be careful in putting them in because the mat, because it's a single row, is not providing any real stability to like a 14 by 14 mat. You just put it down. You don't have to worry so much about where they are as long as it meets up at the corner. But when I put this one in, I have to be careful to kind of set it up because this line won't necessarily be straight because these tiles are more or less, they're almost like putting in individual tiles because they're just a teeny bit of webbing between them. But I think it's going to be fine.
should be fine. I don't have anything slivers. Yeah, the idea on this in tile in general is you don't want less than half of a tile, an individual unit. If there was less than that, then you'd want to try to adjust the layout to shift it over, to always get at least a half of a unit on either side. Like if the one side was a little bit wider here, that'd make the other side a little bit narrower. So there's a degree of freedom in moving this slightly to the right or slightly to the left, but because I have more than half of a unit tile on this side and more than half of a unit tile on that side, then it meets my criteria, okay? I end up with half of a unit tile there, so that's okay. And on this one, this ended up being a perfect tile. That was kind of like my start point. And so I considered the layout acceptable, okay? Anyway, it's a little bit of overkill, but thanks, bye.